The last video initiated us to the French Revolution. Do you remember what it was? The French Revolution was a major political revolution that was intended to overthrow monarchical rule. But if we know only this much of French Revolution, our understanding of this event in history will not be sufficient. To understand any event in history, be that a political or a social or a cultural event, it is imperative on our part to possess a better understanding of the social milieu, the socio-cultural political landscape of that time. With this in mind, in this lesson we will be talking about the background of the French Revolution. Now think about the map that you saw at the beginning of this chapter. You should remember that you saw the Kingdom of France in the place of the Republic of France as you know it now. So, before the French Revolution broke out, France was a kingdom. It was called the Kingdom of France and not the Republic of France. So, why was France a kingdom before this revolution broke out? Any kingdom is ruled by a monarch. That is to say, there is only one head of a kingdom. So, now when we are coming to France as a kingdom, I suppose this question is coming to your mind. What was the structure of this monarchy? And how much power did this monarch exercise over this territory? To understand that, we have to discuss in detail what is a monarchy. Before the French Revolution broke out, France was an absolute monarchy. The very term absolute monarchy brings us to the question that what is a monarchy? A monarchy is a form of government that is ruled by one king or monarch. This king or monarch is considered the head of the state. So, these monarchs generally assume the titles of king or queen, emperor or empress. Monarchies are generally hereditary in nature. What does that mean? That means that when a monarch passes away, that monarch's son or daughter or another relative comes to power. But with that in mind, we should remember that monarchs sometimes had their power reduced, or sometimes elected heads were made the monarchs of a kingdom. Opposed to this concept of a monarchy is the concept of an absolute monarchy. What is that? An absolute monarchy is a form of government where the entire power, all the power, lies at the disposal of one autocratic monarch. What does that mean? That means that this autocratic monarch's rule is the final say of the land. No one can oppose or question or counter the rule of an autocratic monarch. This was also the case in the Kingdom of France before the French Revolution broke out. But would you not like to know that who was this absolute monarch in France before the revolution broke out? Let's find that out. During the 1780s, when France was a kingdom, King Louis XVI was the absolute monarch of the Kingdom of France. And the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette was the queen consort. What does this word queen consort mean? Queen consort means the wife of a monarch. This is opposed to the idea of a queen regnant when the monarch is a queen, when the monarch is a female. But you should definitely remember the names of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette because it is their actions that led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. I suppose all of you love to watch cartoons. Cartoons that we see are mostly meant for a comic effect. But what we see here resembles a cartoon, though isn't as funny as you would like to believe. So let us get into understanding this serious piece of cartoon. What do you see here? This person in a blue robe resembles a priest, and the book that he is holding in his hand resembles the Bible, which means that this is probably the priest or clergy. What do you see in this person? This person's attire tells you about his rank. This person looks like a man of noble birth, and his clothes are telling it to you. You should also understand the importance of the sword he is holding in his hand. It means that he has the power to defend himself with that sword, or even the power to exercise his power on his subordinates. This man looks like a wealthy landowner of sorts. And what are these two people doing? They are standing on a block of stone below which is being squeezed to death another person. But can you tell who this person is? From the clothes he is wearing, you could understand that he is probably a laborer or a peasant. If you look closely into this cartoon, you can see an engraving on this block of stone. What does it read? It reads in French, "Tail import a cove." If I translate that in English for you, it means heavy taxes and unpaid labor. But what does this cartoon signify? I suppose you will be surprised if I tell you that while analyzing this one small piece of cartoon, we were actually discussing the societal structure that was prevalent in France before the French Revolution broke out. But how is it so? Here we can see these two people who can exercise their power and authority are almost stoning to death this one person. And this person has no means at his disposal to defend himself or to protect himself from this imposition. Now this tells you a lot about the societal division of the Kingdom of France. Let's understand that in greater detail. How was the French society divided prior to the revolution? It had many social classes. At the top of everything sat the King of France, followed by the clergy or priest. Then came the royalty or nobility, and they were followed by other professionals in the likes of merchants, doctors, lawyers, bankers. So this was a social pyramid. Now where do we place them? At the top of everything was the monarch, then the first, second and third estates. Who comprised these estates? Clergy comprised the first estate, royalty and nobility the second one, and bourgeois and peasantry comprised the third estate. These were the three estates. Now as a quick question, let me ask you, how many estates were there in the Kingdom of France prior to the French Revolution? Was it 2, 3, 5 or 6? Yes, you were right. The French society was divided into 3 estates before the French Revolution broke out. Now we just discussed how the French society was divided into a tripartite structure. That is to say, there were 3 rungs or 3 social hierarchies. The clergy comprised the first estate, the nobility and the royalty comprised the second estate, and the bourgeois and peasantry comprised the third estate. At the top of this estate system sat the king or the monarch of the Kingdom of France. This we have already understood. But now we should understand how the population of the Kingdom of France was divided among these 3 estates. Since the third estate consisted of everyone else apart from the nobility and the clergy, 98% of the population made up the third estate, As you can see here, they were huge in number. In contrast to the third estate, the clergy comprised only 0.5% of the population and the royalty or nobility comprised 1.5% of the population. So as you can see, the numbers are very different. On the one hand, you have only 0.5% and 1.5% of the population making the first and second estates, and on the other hand, you have the third estate making up 98% of the population. But while discussing that cartoon, we have already thrown light on the fact that while the third estates were huge in number, they did not have power or authority at their disposal. It is only the clergy and the nobility and the king at the top of everything who exercised their power. Now, who comprised this third estate? In this 98% of the population, various social classes were clubbed together. This is something very easy to understand. When one estate is making up 98% of the whole population, people from different professions, from different sectors will make up for this population. So, as we just discussed, that a lot of people were clubbed together in the third estates. And the lot of people could range from a beggar to the wealthiest of merchants of France. So, there was a major social disparity within the third estate itself. In this third estate, or this 98% of the population, one particular section was very important. What were they called? They were called the Bourgeois. The bourgeois made up only 7% of this 98% of the population. They made up only 7% of the third estate. Now, you might question that a section that made up only 7% of this huge population, why are they so crucial and important in our discussion? To understand that, we have to discuss who were the bourgeois. The previous discussion brings us to this question: who were the bourgeois? The bourgeois were, simply put, the middle class of the French society. Middle as in middle of what? Lying between whom? The bourgeois, or this middle class, fell between the nobility or the royalty on one hand and the landless peasants on the other hand. Now, who made up this bourgeois? What kind of people did this bourgeois comprise? Wealthy merchants, working professionals, educated elites made up the bourgeois. That is to say, doctors, lawyers, merchants, artisans and various sort of professionals along with the general learned elite comprise the bourgeois. Now, why are they of any importance to us? It is because that this section of the third estate spearheaded and led the French Revolution. The peasants and other landless people only followed their lead. Now, from where did the bourgeois get their idea to organize and spearhead a revolution? It is not a very easy thing to organize and suddenly rise in rebellion against the monarchical rule. That brings us to the next question, that what was the position of the bourgeois in the French society? Any discussion on the bourgeois requires us to talk about few things. These points are very crucial if we have to understand the social standing of the bourgeois. What are those points? Firstly, the bourgeois was very educated. These were mostly educated people. And by educated people, I mean that they were socially and politically aware. Politically aware of their status in the society. these were not uneducated, illiterate people who could be swayed very easily. So, these were educated people. Along with that, the bourgeois was very affluent. In fact, some members of this section of the society possessed more wealth than the wealthiest landowners. The third point that we should keep in mind when discussing the bourgeois is that they were urban. Urban as in they were centered mostly in cities and towns. So these people were educated, politically aware, urban and very, very affluent. It is for these reasons that they spearheaded the French Revolution, because they resented the monarchical rule, the monarchical impositions on them. Despite being so educated, so affluent and so politically aware, they were clubbed together with the peasants and called the commoners. This was a major source of resentment among the bourgeois. They were not the commoners as the French society called them. The bourgeois has been a very important part of history. But did the French society prior to the outbreak of the revolution give them the position, the respect that they deserved? Definitely not. As I said, clubbed together with other landless, poor, uneducated people, these bourgeois were frustrated with being in the third estate. It is for this reason that they decided to organize a revolution and overthrow the monarchical rule. But that brings us to a very crucial question. Who inspired the bourgeois? From where did they get the idea to organize a revolution and overthrow the French monarch? Previously, we discussed that the bourgeois were frustrated with being in the third estate. It is for this reason that they craved social recognition. Because sometimes they possessed even more wealth, even more lands than the nobility. And these people were self-made. Their wealth wasn't generational. So they were doing everything on their own, despite which they did not get the social rank and recognition that they deserved. It is for this reason that they wanted to reform their position in the French society. So they spearheaded the French Revolution and gave leadership to other members of the third estate. Now we have to discuss the ideas that inspired the bourgeois into reforming their position in society. We have already talked about how educated and learned these people were. These people as in the bourgeois was. So education opens a lot of doors, broadens one's mind and perspective. Education makes one aware of their position in society. Because the bourgeois were so educated, so learned, that they understood that they were being mistreated. They were not being given the social recognition they deserved. From where did they get these ideas? The ideas that inspired them were of the Enlightenment thinkers. I suppose you still remember about the Enlightenment thinkers that we read about in a previous chapter. Enlightenment thinkers in the likes of Voltaire, Rousseau and Montesquieu wrote and talked about a lot of democratic ideas. In their writings was infused the spirit of democracy, the very spirit that inspired the bourgeois. So these Enlightenment thinkers inspired the bourgeois into raising their voices against the monarchical power and want a democratic government. But suddenly a democratic government cannot come to power. For that, they have to overthrow the existent monarchical rule. Which is why the French Revolution took place. We have already discussed that the French Revolution was intended to overthrow the monarch of France. So, to put it simply, the ideas of these Enlightenment thinkers inspired the bourgeois, following which they rose in rebellion against the French monarchical rule and overthrew it. The democratic ideas that inspired the bourgeois made them demand freedom from the monarchical rule. So, they demanded their own political rights and government by the consent of the people. That is to say, in the place of the French monarchy, they wanted a government that would be formed by the consent of people and a government that would also be accountable to the people. What does that mean? That means a democratic government. A government that is formed by the people and are for the people. So, this is what the bourgeois wanted, and this is why they waged this revolution against the French monarchy. While talking about the three estates, we have seen how the King of France was beyond this estate system. The King of France sat at the top of everything, and below him was the three estate system. Now, how was the King of France supposed to talk to the people of these estates, or supposed to consult the people of these three estates? He wasn't a part of this estate system. So, how would he talk to the people who belonged to these estate systems? This brings us to a new point, a discussion on the Estates General. What was the Estates General? This Estates General was a sort of an assembly where the representatives of the three estates came together and the king consulted the three estates through this Estates General. Now, you should keep in mind that the Estates General was a very important thing behind the outbreak of the revolution. Let us find out how. We talked about how the Estates General was a representative assembly, where the representatives of the three estates came together and were being consulted by the King of France. Now, you should keep in mind that this wasn't a permanent body. This wasn't a permanent body in the sense that this body came together only in times of crisis and need. Now, who ascertained if this is a time of crisis, if this is a time of need? It was the King of France who declared if it's a time of crisis, if it's a time of need. So, it was the king's demand that brought together the Estates General. Now, what did the representatives of the three estates do? These representatives were supposed to provide recommendations and certain sort of suggestions to the King of France. In what proportion and percentage this Estates General was representative, we will discuss later. But now, the two things that you should keep in mind are that this wasn't a permanent body. The king felt when this body should come into being and when it should not be. Along with that, the Estates General wasn't like our modern parliaments. These people were supposed to provide recommendations to the king, and it was up to the king whether he would listen to those recommendations or not. But this Estates General played a major role before the revolution broke out. We discussed at great length what the Estates General was, how its structure was, and at what times it came into being. Since it wasn't a permanent body, the king also didn't treat it as one. In fact, the king did not call this Estates General into existence for a whole 175 years. So, 175 years prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution, was the last time when the Estates General came into existence? The Estates General came into existence last in 1614 CE. Suppose the Estates General is a contact on WhatsApp. What would it show? It would show that the Estates General had last came into being, or the Estates General had last existed in 1614 CE. In this lesson, we talked about the political structure or the political landscape that was in place before the French Revolution broke out. We also talked about the tripartite structure of the society, that was the three estates. We talked about the bourgeois and how they were very important in the French society and how educated, informed and aware these citizens were. Having discussed the political structure of French society, we should now delve deeper into the French economy. A thorough understanding of the French economy will give us a better know-how of the tax system that was prevalent in the Kingdom of France. This tax system was also one of the major reasons why the Third Estates broke out in rebellion. It is the French economy and certain other incidents that we will be discussing in the subsequent lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.